Okay. All right. Good deal. All right. So let me try to knock this out here. I may move a little quickly. Well, hopefully we can kind of get it done here within the hour. So section 2, and we're going to spend this week, probably a little bit of next week, just trying to knock out the section on ancient Egypt. This is probably of all the civilizations that we'll talk about in this chapter, the one that people are most familiar with. All right. Mainly, one of the main reasons the Egyptian government's done a great job of maintaining antiquities here. But Egypt, as we're talking about here in the kind of like the 3rd century BC, is often referred to as one of those places that I mentioned as a cultural hearth. And the one thing that kind of unifies 4 of the 5 cultural hearths when it comes to the similarities, when it comes to particularly geography and the focus of the kind of the worksheet you guys did, is that 4 of the 5 all develop around rivers. So last week we had talked about the Sumerians, right, developing in Mesopotamia, mainly around the Tigris and Euphrates, right? The Egyptians, where basically the civilization would not develop without the the Nile River, right? And everyone, you probably heard the Nile River before you heard the Tigris and Euphrates, right? This is, depending upon what information you get, the longest river in the world. The Brazilian government claims that the Amazon's longer, right? I've seen like different kind of disputes here. It's 4,000 miles, over 4,000 miles, stretching from and there's 2 sources really. I have down here the main source being Lake Victoria, which is down by kind of Uganda in the eastern highlands there. And from there, which is what they call the White Nile. The source of what they call the Blue Nile starts in Lake Tana in Ethiopia, and then they meet up around southern Sudan, right there. Okay. So oftentimes ancient Egypt is often referred to as the gift of the Nile. Obviously, because of the river here, this is where we find systematic agriculture. A lot of kind of Egyptian kind of sites kind of started out as kind of Neolithic settlements, if you will. And the worksheet here is a kind of interesting thing about the Nile River that it flows in a northerly direction. The reason being is the further north you get, the elevation goes down. All right. So if there's a question on the test about the Egyptian civilization developed around what river, you will know that because you guys are all pretty smart. All right. So sorry about that. Here's an image, a nice little image here on the Nile. I had down as the Sumerians as the inventors of kind of sailboat scene. More and more, it's probably likely as the Egyptians here. And if you guys watched the video yesterday, the majority of Egyptians tended to live on the eastern side of the Nile, but they wanted to be buried on the western half. We'll talk about kind of funeral rituals and stuff. This is a satellite image today of Egypt. Now, the modern country of Egypt is much larger than what ancient Egypt was. Primarily, ancient Egypt lived, basically, people were around essentially the Nile River right here. And you see the kind of like lushness that still exists there. And still today, majority of those in Egypt tend to live kind of close to the major kind of centers like Cairo and places like that. All right. Good. Now, thinking of this here, mainly because the Nile River flows in a northerly direction, they generally, when talking about ancient Egypt, like to kind of like mention 2 regions. Egypt being made up of 2 regions. All right. And you have to look at it as almost like Egypt is upside down to a certain extent. All right. So you have one region which is Lower Egypt. That's the northern part of ancient Egypt. All right. The geographical feature that dominates that is the delta. All right. And the delta is essentially just a kind of triangular shaped kind of mouth of a river, where a river kind of dumps into a larger body of water, like the Mississippi Delta down by New Orleans, basically dumps into the Gulf of Mexico. The kind of the delta in Egypt there, the river dumps into, it goes into little tributaries and dumps into the Mediterranean Sea. All right, delta is taken from the Greek alphabet. It's a triangle, right? All right, and so this is where initially some of the first kind of like systematic agriculture was occurring in ancient Egypt at this time. All right, and then, I don't know why it does that there. The other region is Upper Egypt. Now, Upper Egypt is the term for the southern half of ancient Egypt. All right, so Lower Egypt is north, Upper is south. Like you said, you have to kind of almost like kind of flip it. The geographical feature, and this is usually generally between past the delta, but right before the first kind of cataract in that area. All right, and so on the map there, the little equal signs represent the cataracts. Cataracts in this term for geographically is just basically an area along a river that has kind of like a lot of currents, like churning rapids, if you will. All right. There was agriculture in this area, but this is also an area where the majority of gold mines were located in ancient Egypt. All right. And so the cataracts served as a kind of geographical barrier. And we'll talk about this in another region that kind of serves as that. So know that upper is south, lower is north, just to kind of give you an indication here. All right. So this is a kind of a visual image of that. All right. So these are terms that in worksheets and kind of and stuff that they use they'll use frequently. Just to give you an idea, it can be kind of confusing. And so, like I said, this is a kind of a graph here. I watch the MTVs, so I try to give the young adults what they're into. All right, and I've learned a few things. Right, you guys are into trap music, chewing gum, chocolate milk, maps, graphs, and charts. I can't play trap music. I'm from the streets. I know what that leads. Somebody banging hammers, somebody getting shot. Chocolate milk, you might be lactose intolerant. I don't want to insult you. Chewing gum, I'd recommend not like putting your hand underneath the desk. You don't want to know what's under there. Maps, graphs, and charts, I can hit you that all day, every day. And this basically shows the elevation as it starts from Lake Victoria all the way down into the Mediterranean Sea. That's why it flows in a northerly direction, because basically the elevation decreases as you go north. That's a nice image. That's right around the third cataract. You can see the background is like a little pyramid there. Now, since modern technology, this is not as dangerous. There's still some areas though that, much like if you go along the Mississippi River, you don't want to be basically kind of swimming across there. All right. But like I said, this did create for a long period of time, for much of the early part of the Egyptian history, a geographical barrier. All right. And so what we start to see here is that the Egyptians basically kind of refer to their regions that they live around and the areas that surround them by two different names. All right. So the Nile plays obviously an important role, right, to Egyptian culture and civilization. But they refer to the area that they lived around as Kemet, which the name means black land. Now, that's the name given for the soil after the floodwaters would recede. Right? And like in the ancient world, floods were a kind of a necessary evil in a lot of these early civilizations. You needed that yearly floods to essentially replenish the soil. So they referred to it as Kemet because the soil was rich in nutrients. All right. So once they kind of the building of dams and stuff like that starts, you start to see the destructive nature of floods diminish a bit. But they were necessary. So majority Egyptians would not refer to their kind of their area they lived as Egypt. They refer to it as Kemet. All right. And then the other region that kind of surrounded where Kemet was the desert, and they refer to it in the kind of the history as Deshret, which means red land. You see the word desert in there. All right. Now, as a result of this, as a result of Deshret as well as the cataracts, Egypt was a little bit different than what Mesopotamia was. Right? There was more geographical barriers. So, like in Mesopotamia, we talked about the Sumerians. Once you get back out past certain mountain ranges, like the Zagros Mountains, you found that this was an area that was relatively flat. You had groups that we said would raid and pillage. Right? In certain cases, some of them would stay on, like the Akkadians. And when the Akkadians stayed on, they kind of integrated into Sumerian culture, changed it a little bit, the Gutians and stuff like that. There wasn't a whole lot of geographical barriers. The Egyptians had the cataracts and Deshret, so for the first couple thousand years of its kind of civilization, it was able to kind of develop independently. Right? So there were essentially the Sumerians and the Egyptians are contemporaries with one another, but you don't find a lot of crossover. The written languages is different. The Egyptians write in hieroglyphics. The Sumerians are kind of cuneiform. The deities, their gods are different. All right. So you see this kind of barrier that allows for the Egyptians to have their own civilization without much kind of influence or interference. All right. That changes after a kind of a period that we refer to as the Middle Kingdom period. All right. But this is just as important as Kemet to kind of the story of Egypt. All right. Let's keep going on there. Now, as we talked about the kind of geography here, we also start to see the development kind of Neolithic sites that eventually kind of organize into what they refer to as agricultural districts called nomes. All right. And initially what you had was basically you had 22 nomes in Lower Egypt and 20 in Upper Egypt. All right. And so there's a number of these where Sicily you initially kind of refer to them as kind of Neolithic sites, essentially. But we start to see kind of the development of people kind of living in communities here. Right? Probably the most famous kind of what they call pre-dynastic period, this is the period before kind of the unification of Egypt, is a nome that in the Egyptians were referred to as Nakan. But a lot of the names that we'll see kind of like there's two names to some of these places and some names for kings and stuff like that. There's Greek names as well because the Greeks are going to colonize Egypt. So it's referred to by the Greeks as Heracleopolis. Anytime you see polis here, that's a Greek term meaning city. All right. So there's evidence of dwellings, but there's also evidence of like kind of the first kind of murals from tombs. And in one of those murals, basically they believe there's a painting of what they consider the world's first zoo. a place where people would go and observe animals. All right. So this is a kind of an example of dwellings here in Heracanopolis, kind of like apartments. All right. And this is what they call Tomb 100. This is what they believe. Can't really quite tell from there, but like you see, like kind of gazelles and like up there, and some other animals. They're almost like kind of like separated by pens, if you will. So a lot of them were animals that were within the area, like crocodiles, hippopotamuses, but there's even lions and stuff like that, monkeys in there. So they believe that they were used for just how we go to zoos today. People just kind of observe these animals in kind of a controlled setting. All right. So that's why the theory is that Heracanopolis may have been the first recorded zoo in world history. Don't write this down. Guess what it's for? My impending Alzheimer's. And so essentially around 3200 BC, they believed that the nomes actually in each area, Lower and Upper Egypt, unified. All right. And at the head of each of these, what they refer to, historians refer to cleverly as a nomarch. All right. The nomarch in Lower Egypt, they believe, wore a red crown. The one in Upper Egypt wore a kind of tall white one, looked like a bowling pin. And then in 3100 BC, all right, we find that these two areas unify. All right. The one thing that separates kind of Egyptian history from Sumerian history is that relatively early in its history, they unified in the concept of a country, a nation, to a certain extent. All right. Whereas the Sumerians, for the most part, in their early history, were a collection of independent city-states which shared certain cultural traits, but they each had their own kind of kingships and stuff. All right. So the guy who's credited with unifying Upper and Lower Egypt in 3100 BC is this figure named Menes, who's one of these figures like Gilgamesh we talked about in Sumer, who's historical in nature, but a lot of the stories related to him are somewhat like kind of based on legend. Like there was one story that he was out hunting with his dogs, and his dogs turned on him for whatever reason. And to escape that, he jumped on the back of two crocodiles, and they basically kind of like he was like water skiing, that took him across the other side of the Nile in safety. As a result, he made an entire city dedicated to the god Sobek, who had the head of a crocodile. And so when the Greeks came across it, they referred to it as Crocdopolis, like the city of the crocodile, if you will. All right. Menes, though, what it does is by unifying Upper and Lower Egypt, creates the first capital. All right. And the city of Memphis, where the city in Tennessee gets its name from, there's some similarities. The city of Memphis, Tennessee, like the Memphis in Egypt, is along a river. All right. Has anyone ever driven into Memphis on 55 South? One of the first things you see is that big glass pyramid. That's a nod to this Egypt. Now, for a while there, when it initially built, it was like kind of an information center. I think in the early 2000s, they turned it into a Bass Pro Shop, for whatever reason. All right? I don't know what it is still here. All right. And so this is where we see the difference between the Sumerians and the Egyptians. The Egyptians unified relatively early in their history. All right. Now, this story of unification is actually not listed on any kind of document or whatever like that. There's what they call the Narmar palette, which is it's kind of like stone like plate, if you will. And it's called Narmar because there's another figure named Narmar that sometimes they believe Menes and Narmar may be the same person. All right, there's some debate about this because it's so early in history. But whoever it is, Menes probably or Narmar, is essentially subjugating the people of Lower Egypt. He's got his staff there. Now there's some people being kind of like running there. This figure up here, that is supposed to represent the god Horus. Did you guys watch the video yesterday? Mm-hmm. All right. The god Horus, one of his jobs was to bestow power upon the kings. Right. So what this is basically saying is that this kind of unification, this subjugation, if you will, was essentially kind of basically sanctioned by the gods. Again, much like we talked about Hammurabi's code, where you have that image of Hammurabi receiving the laws from the god Samesh. This is an image for people who are not necessarily literate. All right. So eventually, what he basically does, Menes, the story is that he combined the two crowns into what later kings would wear. Right? I couldn't find a good image of that, but I found this thing where you could make like arts and crafts in class, and this kid looks real serious, and that's his crown. All right. And so what ends up happening here is that Menes creates what we often refer to as the first dynasty. And dynasties aren't just exclusive to Egyptian history. Dynasties basically rulers of the same family, right? And so all in all, you have over the 3,000 plus years of Egyptian history, you have 31 families that are essentially ruling. All right, that's not a lot when you think about it. All right, over a long period of time. Okay, but that's enough that we do have some transitions, and we'll talk about on Thursday. These transitions usually kind of referred to as kingdom or intermediate periods. All right, but like I said, it's not just basically in Egyptian history. When we talk next chapter, we'll talk about Chinese history. There's a big emphasis on dynasties, right? All right, so what we see at the head of each Egyptian dynasty is a king, right? And famously, the Egyptian kings were referred to as pharaohs, right? And so, in reality, the name pharaoh actually means great house. It was initially meant to describe the royal family. It wasn't until a period known as the New Kingdom period that we'll talk about on Thursday that term is basically given specifically for the king. Right? So Menes never heard that term pharaoh. He was never given that title. Right? It was the title for the entire royal family. All right. Now the thing about the pharaohs that gave them the justification to rule, all right, because like I say, religion and politics tend to go hand in hand in ancient civilizations, is that they had inherently something in them differently than the rest of us. All right. Now, obviously, it's their ability to kind of maneuver around kind of like political intrigue, and have a little bit of like kind of an army behind them. But the idea, like kind of like psychologically, was that they were demigods. All right, they were part human, part divine. All right, and the relationship with the gods was particularly important. A lot of times you would see, like the video talk about Ramses the Great. Ramses would have plenty of statues and like images of him hanging out with the gods, sitting next to the gods, because that's who he kicks it with. All right, and so all like basically the success of the kind of Egypt was basically kind of like related to the fact that the pharaoh, like his relationship with the gods. If it was everything was great, then the harvest was coming and such like that, then he would get all the credit. Conversely, though, if things happen like famines and kind of civil war and stuff like that, he tended to get blamed. That's why we have 31 different kind of families kind of ruling over a period of time. All right, and so what we also start to see here is that it's believed that the pharaohs, right, kind of ruled in the afterlife. And another thing that separates the Egyptians from the Sumerians is this concept of an afterlife. The Sumerians had a pretty bleak kind of image of, like, remember they in that story Gilgamesh, they referred to the underworld as the house of dust. Everybody went there. It wasn't very pleasant. For the Egyptians, it's a little bit different. All right. The idea was you go into the afterlife and it would be like it was on Earth, but better. All right. That's why people were buried with things. And the idea here was that you have two concepts within Egyptian culture called Ka and Ba. All right. They're somewhat similar, not just sound, but kind of the meaning. But Ka is like the eternal spirit. So when a person would die, and initially this was only just for the pharaoh and his family, when they would die, their Ka would leave their body. Now, they would eventually have to meet back up with it in the afterlife, and then they would go through a series of trials and stuff like that. All right. So but for the Ka to meet back up with your body, the body needed to be relatively intact. So the Egyptians started to do what tradition to kind of maintain the body was intact? Mummification, right? And so in many cases, you would see like kind of these pharaohs buried with statues of themselves with these kind of like, it looked like these hands that were saying touchdown, like a disc in there, to basically let the Ka know this is where the body is. This is where the body is. All right. And we'll talk about later. This idea is going to be extended to commoners, but initially it was only particularly for the pharaoh and his royal family. Now, some of these kings decided that they needed bigger beacons to attract the Ka to their body. So what they started to do was build these massive structures to let the Ka know that there's an important person here, and that's the pyramids. All right. So like we were talking about ziggurats last week. Ziggurats were basically these temples that are in the middle of Sumerian city-states that would be used for ceremonies. It was a civic structure, all right? It represented the entire city. Pyramids, which often are referred to as the first major stone structures, because remember, ziggurats were built with mud bricks, were strictly for the megalomania of particular kings, all right? And so they were basically, the idea was to draw the Ka to the body, let them know that they can meet back up. Also, too, was to show that you're a very important person, right? The problem is that this also attracted grave robbers. And like all the pyramids have been looted, have long been looted. So they do kind of while you're kind of creating these structures, you're basically kind of also kind of advocating for someone to kind of steal from you. You know, it's just kind of the nature of that. All right. So the first pyramid was built, and the pyramids are only built during what they call the Old Kingdom period, which actually within the 3rd and 4th dynasties. All right. The first major pyramid was mentioned in the video yesterday. And that's the pyramid at Saqqara, the step pyramid at Saqqara. That's built for a pharaoh during the 3rd dynasty by the name of Joseon. All right. Now, actually, the architect is probably more famous than the pharaoh himself, and that's Imhotep. Imhotep is a classic polymath, person who's well-versed in math, architecture, science, and stuff like that. He was Joseph's vizier, his basically right-hand man. He developed what was initially a mastaba, and then built onto it. All right. So Imhotep is actually deified as the god of mathematics, all right, as a result of this. Okay. The next family decided, hey, we want to kind of outdo that. So the founder of the family was a guy named Senefra. All right, Senefra built something called that initially was going to build a perfect pyramid. The one side of it was kind of bent. They called it the bent pyramid. But his son actually was able to kind of build a massive pyramid. Senefra is buried in one, but smaller. The largest pyramid, which is the only one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world left standing, the Great Pyramid of Giza. That's built for the second king in the 4th dynasty, a guy named Khufu. Khufu is often referred to as Cheops, which is his Greek name. All right, and so this is essentially about 481 feet tall. It was up until the Lincoln Cathedral in England in 1311, the tallest stone structure. Like the video said, it's basically it's something like 203 or something like that billion bricks or something, million bricks, each of them weighing a ton at least. All right, it's a perfect square at its base. All right, it's essentially, this is kind of like the basically it's going to set the pattern for his son Khepri, who is going to be basically the image for the Sphinx, and then Mechanus. So this is Giza is what they call the necropolis. All right. So this is like within inside there. There's various chambers. All right, faux chambers. So if you get in there, you can kind of get trapped, if you will. This is what it looks like from a distance. And then this is overlooking the modern capital, Cairo. So like I said, here's Khufu's, or Cheops's, Khepri, who is right in front of us, the Sphinx, and then Mechanus. All right, now, Mechanus, which is the smallest, they believe actually was, and there's a lot of mystery behind like how this was built, because they didn't leave behind like basically a kind of a how-to list, how to construct. And so, but for a long time, they thought it was built by slave labor. In reality, probably the majority of labor that was used to build this were basically kind of stonemasons, obviously, and farmers who were on their off season. All right, and people got paid for it. The first, they believe, during the building of this pyramid, the first recorded strike in world history may have been related to the building of this pyramid. They found something was basically these workers stated that they wouldn't lift another stone unless they got their monthly ration of beer. So the first kind of recorded strike in world history may have been related to beer. All right. And then has anyone ever watched those ancient alien shows where that one guy who's always talks to all his answers, all his aliens? That seems like it's on. Like I was leaving this morning and then flipping around TV and on the History Channel, that it was on there. But basically, it was just like there was the way it's built, and it's maybe like aliens kind of communicating through mathematics and stuff like that. All those theories. The problem is that we don't have a kind of like, even though there's an extensive amount of writing in Egypt, we don't have a specific list states on how it was built. Later, people at home. Later, seniors.